What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 5 of season 2 of House of the Dragon, an episode directed by Claire Kilner and written by Ty Mickle, or Mikkel, I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation. In any event, very solid episode. Definitely a step down from the magnitude and the greatness of episode 4. I should admit, I've watched the climax, or the final battle for episode 4 5 times at this point. It's my favorite piece of pop culture entertainment to be enjoyed this summer. Right up there alongside the DLC for Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. I feel like if you're a fantasy fan and like hardcore dark adult fantasy, summer 2024 has been, let's just say, it's been a very rich vein of forbidden pleasures and delights and that sort of thing. But even though this latest episode wasn't quite on the level of episode 4, it did introduce a few interesting plot lines and storylines, which we're going to get right into. And also, spoiler warning, if you have not watched the episode, go do so. But I'm going to skip right to the dessert of the episode, the final scene where we see Rhaenyra and Jace plotting and scheming about how to get a few more dragons on their side, because for people who know their Targaryen history, obviously there have been kings and queens before the current rulers that are fighting for the Iron Throne, and pretty much all those kings and queens were dragon riders, and two of the most famous, Jaehaerys and his wife Alysanne, or Alysanne? I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation. I've heard it in the audio fiction, but in any event, Jaehaerys, the old king, the king who was king before Viserys. He and his wife ruled for many, many decades, and they had two very old dragons, one by the name of Vermithor and one by the name of Silverwing, and they have remained riderless ever since. But they're right there in Dragonstone, waiting to be claimed, and if they can find riders, I mean, it's complicated because you have to have the blood of the Targaryens. In theory, at least that's what the old Valyrians have claimed for a long time. But, Targaryens, they are fond of begetting bastard children and that sort of thing, and some of them marry into lesser houses. There are plenty of people out there who can lay claim to a little Targaryen blood, and so Rhaenyra and Jace come up with the excellent plan of looking for some riders for those dragons, because if you can get Vermithor and Silverwing on your side, Vhagar is no longer quite as scary. Vhagar's still the biggest dragon, but the Team Green doesn't have as many dragons, and once again, there are also a few wild dragons still exploring Dragonstone as well, and so it's going to be very interesting to see basically like tryouts. It's going to be like baseball tryouts or basketball tryouts, people trying to make the team as they line up dozens, perhaps hundreds of people who are brave enough and suicidal enough to try to become dragon riders. And I don't know if we'll see that next episode or if we'll see a resolution of that before the end of the season, but the teaser for the next episode looks absolutely fantastic, where we see how Aemon's a little worried that Daemon will be successful in rallying all of his forces in the Riverlands. And so Aemon's like, fuck it, I'll face Daemon. And so we all know inevitably there's going to be a face-off between Daemon and Aemon, and I won't spoil that conflict here. If you want to spoil it for yourself, well, I won't even say spoil it for yourself. If you want to know what happens, I always recommend reading Fire and Blood, because Fire and Blood, that's what came first. That's the official version of the story. This show is just, it's living in its shadow, doing its best to adapt it. But what I can say without offering any spoilers, if you're a fan of either Daemon or Aemon, and I've seen a lot of people recently saying that Aemon's their new favorite character on the show, but if you're a fan of either of those characters, you will be thrilled and delighted where those storylines eventually lead to in the future. I don't know if it'll be the next season or season 4. I've heard that they're planning on doing 4 seasons total, but yeah, there's some really cool shit right over the horizon. But let's sink our teeth into this episode, where we see the consequences in the aftermath of the Battle of Rook's Rest. And obviously, Rook's Rest is a pretty inconsequential little castle, apart from the fact that its lord is a part of Rhaenyra's small council. But it's just amazing how this little inconsequential keep that's lightly garrisoned, how it could turn into this astonishing battle with such astonishing consequences. And if you want to get the full deep dive into that battle, I strongly recommend all the documentaries that they keep posting on YouTube. Basically, if you go to the House of the Dragon channel on YouTube, they're posting these really cool documentaries after every episode. It's almost like a great little film school. If you want to go work in film and television, watch those docs, because you get to see how the episodes are put together, basically from all the different departments' points of view and that sort of thing. They're absolutely fantastic. But both sides obviously took heavy losses. Losing Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys was a mighty blow to Team Black, because that was the largest dragon on their side, which puts them at a huge disadvantage. But Team Green, they lost Aegon. I mean, as we see, Aegon is brought back into town in this wooden crate, and all that Valyrian armor has been basically burned onto his flesh. And we see how the maesters have to get in there and dig at it, and every time they dig a little plate off, it starts fresh bleeding. It was absolutely disgusting. And at one point, there's a close-up to one of his broken bones, so they just pop the bones back together. I mean, it was truly revolting. But Aegon, as the Maesters say, might not ever wake up again. He's just, he's all fucked up. Half his body's covered in burns and scars. He is an absolute monstrosity. And Aemon doesn't seem to be bothered one bit. And I loved how Aegon's crate was being brought into King's Landing, as well as the head of Meleys. At one point, Alicent looks over at Aemon, and she sees Aegon's dagger sticking through his belt, and you can tell she's suspicious that Aemon may have played a role, at least to some extent, in what went down with Aegon. But obviously, nobody made Aegon fly to that battle. He's a drunken, petulant, almost kind of like irrational, emotional teenager in a lot of ways. He decided to fly up against Rhaenys and Meleys, and he got his ass kicked, and then obviously got his ass kicked further when Aemon decided to blast both the dragons just to keep things simple. But there are some great little details that I want to call attention to in these early sequences. First and foremost, when they're bringing Meleys' head through King's Landing, I love seeing the way that the sun interacted with the bugs that were swirling around the severed neck, because sometimes these dragons can look a little cartoony. Obviously, every show's got budgetary limitations, and trying to make these dragons feel real and tactile is challenging. But if you can show how the light or the environment is interacting with them, that makes them seem more like they're actually, like they're real. And it was just so cool seeing like the little bit of bugs swirling around. It's like, all right, y'all are doing you're going the extra mile to make it all the more believable. But another detail that I found interesting was when they're removing Aegon from that crate, they also removed that sword, Blackfire. And Blackfire is just an important reminder of the trappings or the symbols of power for the Targaryen family. So much so, I mean, that sword belonged to Aegon the Conqueror, and whoever wields Blackfire usually has a pretty strong claim to the throne, no matter what their bloodline might be. And many years later, there'll be these 5 wars called the Blackfire Rebellions, the last of which is the War of the Nine Penny Kings. But for people who are like diehard Westerosi scholars and historians, they are totally obsessed with all the Blackfire rebellions. But it's just an important reminder of all these little details. And these are all the details that make up and kind of flesh out the world that George R. R. Martin has created. And I just like it when this show pays very specific attention to all these important details, because they will have dividends and consequences down the road. And speaking of consequences, Sunfire is so fucked up from its battle with Meleys. Sunfire's been left back at Rook's Rest, and there'll be more about Sunfire in the chapters to come. I don't know if we'll see Sunfire again this season, but Sunfire nearly got a wing torn off, obviously got its belly torn open, got totally fried with fire. Sunfire is totally destroyed, but Sunfire is still alive, and it's on the loose, so to speak. But obviously, politically, Aegon's condition leaves a big question up in the air as to who should rule in his stead until he recovers. And Alicent, basically, her point of view is, well, I ruled for many, many years when my husband was sick. I've got a lot of experience. Like, let me step up, and I'll be the regent for the time being. And everyone on her small council totally turns against her. Like, first it's Larys, a.k.a. Clubfoot, who decides to take Aemon's side. But Larys reminds him that Cole, as the Hand of the King, speaks with the voice of the king. And Cole, without making any eye contact with Alicent, says, Aemon is next in line. And you can just see the rage boiling over. And I love that scene as, like, the camera is pushing in on Alicent. And you can tell, like, there's, like, blood pumping in her ears. She can barely hear what people are discussing all around her. She's just stewing in her rage, and she confronts Cole about it later on, and Cole basically says, look, we've given this war over to the dragons. I saw men melting in the battlefield. I would spare you the horror of having to do the things that we must do. And obviously, I think they're loving clandestine secret affairs, probably over at this point. And it'll be interesting to see how Alicent conducts herself moving forward. Because remember, Otto Hightower is still out there. He's coming from Old Town, which is very far away, but he's coming with an army. And with that army is one of the children of Viserys, one of his youngest children, who is a dragon rider. So the Hightowers still have a few sharp teeth left in their mouth. But just to wrap things up with Aemon and his storyline, 2 of his biggest decisions are he cuts in on the rat catchers, and he also decides to seal King's Landing, which is only going to exacerbate the problems with the shortage of food. The blockade of King's Landing is starting to have a huge effect. And we see through the eyes of Hugh Hammer. And to be honest, I'm just not that interested in this story involving Hugh Hammer's daughter. He's a major character from the book later, but all this stuff with his daughter in King's Landing has been invented for the show. But we see how his daughter's still getting sick and she's dying, etc. and so forth. He and his wife and child try to leave, and they're trapped in King's Landing, which is obviously going to start turning some of the small folk against Aemon and his heavy-handed tactics. But as chaotic as things in King's Landing might be, with people saying how it's an ill omen, seeing the head of a dragon, and the dragons are not gods, and blah, 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 things are pretty chaotic over on Dragonstone as well, because Team Black's small council, basically there's a lot of confusion and anger, and Rhaenyra is losing her patience, but losing their largest dragon on their side has definitely, sowed the seeds of doubt in their group, and Rhaenyra starting to resent the fact that while she was a cupbearer and she was working for her father and she was learning the names of all the lords around the Seven Kingdoms, she never really learned like battle tactics or strategy. And while all these guys at the table seem to think that they are masters of strategy, in spite of having just as little experience on the battlefield as she has, she's having a little trouble maintaining their confidence, especially the confidence of her son Jace. And Jace basically decides to go off on his own and take some action. And he's actually very effective when he decides to do. He decides to go after the Freys, because the Freys, if people remember, they were the family that betrayed Robb Stark. I guess, was it season 2 of Game of Thrones, or was it season 3? I can't remember when the Red Wedding was. In any event, those are the Freys, but obviously that's in the far distant future. Those horrible deeds have not happened yet. But we see Jace flying up to see the Freys, and he's actually a pretty cunning negotiator, and he basically gets a commitment from them to bend the knee to Rhaenyra and allow all the Starks to pass down into Westeros, provided if they let the Freys have Harrenhal. And they also want the protection of dragons as well, because while it's all well and good to say they're on the side of Team Black, if Vhagar comes a calling, they're going to need dragons to protect them. But it's interesting seeing Jace, who's still young and still inexperienced, taking action, making alliances, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I'm becoming a big fan of the character of Jace. But meanwhile, Daemon is still struggling in the Riverlands. He's told the news that Larys very successfully took all the gold of his family in that castle to King's Landing. And so basically, Daemon's trying to run this castle and trying to raise an army with very few resources at his fingertips. And meanwhile, he's having to deal with these goddamn Brackens and what's the other family? I keep getting the Brackens and the Blackwoods confused. And I think that's part of the genius of this show, is that nobody can keep the different sides apart, but like they absolutely despise one another. They've been feuding for a long time, but Daemon has to figure out a way to get them to work for him. And one of the coolest shots of the season, we see how it's Lord Bracken who's asked to bend the knee or his house will burn, and he says, "Well, we'd rather burn than serve." And one of my favorite shots, he turns his back on Daemon, and we see Caraxes out of focus behind him. And I thought Caraxes was going to just swallow him, but Daemon realizes somebody with that much courage in their veins, like he'll be useful on the side, so he really wants to use Lord Bracken in the war to come. But Daemon's doing his best to get Harrenhal into fighting shape. We even see him out there chopping wood and getting blisters and that sort of thing, but he's still plagued by all these very strange dreams. And in true Targaryen fashion, he has a very erotic, wet dream about having sex with his mother, the dirty dog. But, Targaryens, I wouldn't say that's normal, but it's definitely not completely outside the realm of possibility. I mean, after all, Daemon is the uncle to Rhaenyra, and they've got several children. The Targaryens, they're a little freaky when it comes to incest, but while this show's been very, very tame and very light on eroticism throughout this season, and that scene was a little tame as well, at least it was a little hint of sexuality. That's one of my only real complaints about House of the Dragon, is that all the fantastic nude scenes that were prevalent in the early seasons of Game of Thrones, those are largely missing from this show. However, sex is not a big part of the book Fire and Blood. It's not like they're taking out all these hot sex scenes from the book and just choosing to discard them, but that was just a big part of the appeal of Game of Thrones. And so at least we got a little titillation, even if it was kind of creepy, kind of perverted, but we see how Daemon, he still yearns to be king. He still feels like he was stepped over. He still feels like he was the stronger son, and his mother saying like, "Oh, you were the stronger son. You should have come first. You're the stronger swordsman." Blah blah blah. And we're starting to see his ambition, where what he really wants to do is march on King's Landing, take it, and then invite Rhaenyra, if she wishes to join him at his side, to rule side by side as king and queen. And he insists on people calling him my king, not even king consort, but my king. But there seems to be some progress at least taking place in the Riverlands. The Blackwoods have overwhelmed the Brackens. However, a lot of atrocities are being committed in Daemon's name, and a lot of the River Lords are refusing to raise their banners for a tyrant that would order the son of his nephew, the son of his nephew, to be killed. His reputation is a pretty nasty one and well-deserved, no matter how much he might protest against it. But judging from some of the lines of dialogue in the teaser for next week's episode, at a minimum, Aemon seems to be taking Daemon very seriously in the force that he is gathering. But as far as some of the other subplots are concerned, we saw that Mysaria managed to sneak one of her agents into King's Landing. I'm not quite sure what her agenda is, but I'm sure we'll find out soon. And we also got a scene in the Eyrie where we see how the current ruler of the Eyrie, she wants dragons to protect her from the sky, because no army's ever been able to take the Eyrie, because you have to basically go up that horrible canyon through the mountains. It's totally inaccessible. But the dragons that are there right now are basically just babies, and so she's looking for a few more assurances before she commits all of her forces to Rhaenyra's side. And we also got some good scenes with Corlys, aka the Sea Snake, where we see he's still very much in mourning from the loss of Rhaenys and how he feels like he's given enough to Rhaenyra's war, but Rhaenyra asks him to be her hand, and so at that point he asks Baela to be his official heir. I mean, she reminds him, look, I'm of fire and blood and I plan on dying that way. You should really look for an heir or a successor that comes from like the salt and sea. And then the episode draws to a close with a really good scene between Rhaenyra and Jace, which I've already discussed, but there's one little detail that I left out. We see Rhaenyra studying her histories, and she's in particular studying the character of Visenya. Visenya was the older of the two wives of Aegon the Conqueror. He was married to his two sisters. Like, he relied upon Visenya for strength, but he was in love with Rhaenys, the younger of the sisters, and that's who the Rhaenys that we saw die in episode 4 is named after. But Visenya was the first wielder of Dark Sister, which is the sword carried by Daemon, and she was also the first rider of Vhagar, but she was hell on wheels, very tough. When you read Fire and Blood about the early days of Aegon the Conqueror's conquest of the Seven Kingdoms, oftentimes he and his sisters would kind of divide and conquer and fly off in different directions, and Visenya, she was a little severe and a little serious, and not necessarily the more attractive of the two sisters, but she was very effective. And where she really plays into the histories or becomes much more important, she is the mother of Maegor. And Maegor is arguably the most fucked up, cruel, tyrannical, diabolical Targaryen that ever lived. I'm fascinated by each and every single story featuring Maegor. But yeah, if you want to see the Targaryens at their worst, read about Visenya and Maegor. But it's interesting seeing Rhaenyra realizing, like, I need to take a more active hand, and by, basically following in the footsteps of someone like Visenya, who, once again, was just absolutely hell on wheels during Aegon's initial conquest of Westeros. So it seems like she is gearing up and getting prepared to play a more active role. And there was a shot in the teaser for next week's episode where we see Rhaenyra holding a sword, and obviously can't learn to wield a sword overnight, but it does seem like, obviously, who needs a sword when you have a goddamn dragon? But I look forward to seeing Rhaenyra taking action, because one of my only real complaints about this season is that Rhaenyra's been largely ineffective. And I think one of the main reasons why she seems to be ineffective is that the book depicts her in more or less kind of like an increasingly negative light as the war progresses. But because the show is trying to portray her as the hero, they're basically having to ignore all the scenes from the book featuring Rhaenyra and invent new scenes. And I just don't feel like they haven't done as good a job depicting Rhaenyra as a hero or in a heroic light as they did with Viserys in season 1. Because Viserys is a big, fat, chubby, drunken loser in the book. And yet with Paddy Considine, the way he portrayed the character, they made him seem so noble and just like so. That scene where he's limping up to the Iron Throne in season 1 was so stirring and so powerful. And I feel like what they need to do is invent some scenes like that for Rhaenyra if they're hell-bent upon making Rhaenyra the heroic figure that they seem to want her to portray her as. In any case, we only have 3 episodes left. I can't wait to see what they include in these final episodes. It's going to break my heart when this is over, especially when we have The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power coming our way at the end of August, a show which is going to seem so much more lame and so much more inept in comparison to episode 4 of season 2 of House of the Dragon. I feel like the great curse of that show, first and foremost, they have terrible writers and just a terrible plan for that show overall. But when you do the side-by-side compare and contrast with House of the Dragon, it just makes all of its shortcomings all the more clear and apparent. But I'm going to take the wins where I can. The fact that we have a good fantasy show and a good fantasy game all this summer, that is a good summer for fantasy fans, and I am grateful. But I look forward to seeing what people think down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has an amazing week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.